So welcome back to our review series on the Simucube 2. Now, so far we've taken a look at the hardware differences between the Sport, the Pro, and the Ultimate. We've also taken a detailed look at the difference in the driving experience between the Pro and the Ultimate. And today's video was going to be a comparison between the Pro and the Fanatec DD2. But what I realized throughout the process of all my testing and when I sat down to write the script for that particular video is that it made a little bit more sense to compare the Pro against the Sport first, and then compare the DD2 and DD1 against the Pro and the Sport more directly. What I realized is that a lot of my observations between the Pro and the DD2 were very similar to my observations between the Sport and the DD1. So I'm gonna make that a single video after this one, but today we're gonna be comparing these two guys. So as we saw when we took a closer look at the hardware of all three models, build quality and things like that, and I would encourage you to watch that video before watching this one if you haven't already, linked above my head and the description below for you. Yeah, look, the hardware in terms of build quality and everything is pretty much exactly the same between the Pro and the Sport models. The only difference being a few of the electronics around the motor drive circuitry, so obviously being able to deliver more power, and the motors themselves. So the Pro is 32% stronger than the Sport at 25 Newton meters peak strength as opposed to the 17 on the Sport. There's also what on paper at least appears to be a significant difference in the slew rate between the two as well. So the Pro has a slew rate of 8 Newton meters per millisecond, whereas the Sport has a slew rate of 4.8 Newton meters per millisecond. Now, the Ultimate that we looked at yesterday, that has a slew rate of 9.5 Newton meters per millisecond. And there was a slightly noticeable difference just in the sharpness of the response between the Pro and the Ultimate. So the numbers would indicate that we should see a more significant difference in the way the Pro responds compared to the Sport. So we'll definitely be having a look at that in detail today as well. But we're going to follow exactly the same formula as we did with the comparison between the Pro and the Ultimate. So I'll take you along for the first driving experience as I recorded it 2 weeks ago, and then we'll take a more detailed look at the differences between the two based on my experience having driven with them both for about 2 weeks now. So let's get going on the driving tests. Okay, so all set up and running here now. As before with the Pro, we are running the latest version of the TrueDrive software, and we are about to install the latest firmware too. So 2020.7 is the latest version that came out about 2 weeks ago as the time of recording this, so end of July. So I'm going to power up the base now. I just want to show you the process of upgrading the firmware. I didn't show you with the Pro, but I do think it's an important part of the process. So we should see it show up and be detected here. And immediately it pops up with the firmware update wizard. So firmware must be updated, reason, to old version, blah, 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 blah. Don't need to bother about reading all of that for the purpose of the video, but I do suggest if you're doing firmware updates, always read all of the prompts that come up on the screen, because sometimes there are some important things that you don't want to miss. But we're going to click next. And you can see now it should have put the base into firmware upgrade mode. There we go. So found Simucube in firmware upgrade mode. Press next to continue. Press next to start the update process. So they're really making you click, click, click. They want to make sure that you're absolutely sure you want to do this. There we go. Now it's going through the process of flashing. So unlike with the Fanatec ecosystem, there is only one software package to install, and it sort of automatically prompts you through all of the firmware updates, very similar to how it works with Fanatec. Obviously, wheels and things like that are separate with Simucube, but we'll talk about that more when we do our Simucube versus Fanatec comparison video in a couple of days' time. We'll just wait for this to run through the process. Almost done now. I like that it tells you how long to expect it to take as well, so you're not sort of sitting there freaking out. So there we go. It should reboot itself. We should hear the little boop. There it is. Finish, and we reopen TrueDrive again. We should see it up and running with the latest versions. So there we go. There we are. Operational, good. Everything's working. It's a good start. So we can see our wheel center is completely off there. So I'm going to set that to center as well. So we go reset center, set permanent wheel center. We'll enable high torque mode as well. So we need to scroll to the bottom. We're going to wait for the little prompt to time out here, automatic activation. So if you don't do this, it beeps at you and it automatically disconnects the high torque mode. And then the next time you switch it on, you have to start again. But we're going to set it so that it will automatically come on high torque mode every time. Activate high torque. And a whole bunch of safety warnings. Again, they really do take this seriously because it isn't a toy. It really can hurt you. Even the Sport can hurt you. So we'll activate high torque automatically. And there we go. We're now in high torque mode. Last thing we need to do is connect our wheel. So we'll go in here to wireless. We'll switch the wheel on. You can see it pops up immediately. Signal strength is 100, just like it was with the Pro. Click on it and click on selected device, connect selected device. And we should see now connection strength 100%. So we'll just rotate that all the way around, show you as with the Pro the other day, it is staying on 100% connection strength with that new antenna system. So that's all good. And then we just need to get into loading our profiles. So we'll do exactly the same test as we did with the Pro to begin with for a first drive. So we'll do the Lotus 79 around old school Silverstone Grand Prix circuit. So I'm going to load the cooked in iRacing profile, exactly the same as we did the other day. So iRacing advanced mode. And you can see there, by default, it's set to 6.3 Newton meters. We're definitely going to want more than that. So I'm going to crank this up to 12 Newton meters, which is the same as what I had for my Pro test the other day. So we'll go back down to, oh, come on, you can do it. You can do it. It only wants to do 12.1 or 10.9, or 11.9 rather. There we go, that'll do. I don't think we're going to notice a difference between 0.1 of a Newton meter. All right, let me just quickly look at my other settings that I had the other day here on this other screen too, just to make absolutely sure we're running the same. So reconstruction filter set to 5. And again, if you haven't seen already, I do have another video where I took you through all the various settings in the Simucube TrueDrive software and exactly what they mean. So definitely check that out, linked above my head for you and in the description for you right now. But what do we have here? We had 15%, just cross-checking here, 9%, 5%. And then I had static force reduction I had set to, it scrolled up on me in the video, but I did actually end up setting it back to 20% before I set off. So we're going to set that at 20% just for my initial drive. Obviously, I will play around with this, play around with it turned off as well a little bit later on in the video when I'm doing more experimentation. Now, slew rate limit, this is what we were talking about with the difference between the Pro and the Sport with the higher slew rate on the Pro. So you can adjust this on this wheel between 0 and 4.58. I'm going to leave it off for now, just while I'm doing my initial test. There we go. So we're going to save that to the Simucube, and then we'll jump into iRacing and go for a drive. All right, so we'll quickly go through and calibrate everything from scratch again. I'm getting so used to doing this. All right, and we started off with 12 Newton meters. So we're going to crank that down to 12. Go. Everything else is exactly the same as it was with the Pro test. Just double check that quickly here as well. Yep, that all looks exactly the same. Okay, I think we're good to go. All right, gloves on, seatbelt on. Let's do this. So, all right. Once again, the way they're able to replicate that feeling of a real life steering rack is just incredible. There's not a hint of notchiness or graininess or cogging effect or ripple effect or anything like that. It's just absolutely smooth. And again, just like I said, just like I commented on with the Pro, you can feel the weight of the car shifting as you sort of turn the wheels. Obviously, as the wheels turn, it lifts up one side of the car or the other, and you feel that increase in the weight through the steering. You can feel the texture of the road surface underneath as well. It's just, I mean, yeah, as I said before, the Simucube 2s and, you know, the Pro, the Ultimate before it, and the Sport now as well are the only wheelbases I've ever tested that don't have any hint of grain or notchiness or anything that sort of tricks your mind into remembering that you're, you know, connected to an electric motor and not a real life car. So I wanted to highlight that before we head out, but let's drive out now. Try not to stall. So we are running at 12 Newton meters, so exactly the same strength as what we had with the Pro initially before we cranked that up to 25. So I'm not expecting any difference in terms of the overall feeling of weight and strength. Where we might feel a little bit of difference though is in that slew rate that we were talking about before. So the slew rate is about half with the Sport as what it was with the Pro. So we might feel a little less responsiveness and a little more muddiness in the force feedback details, things like road texture, sharp bumps, and running over ripple strips and things like that. So let's have a little drive here and see what we can feel. We are on cold tires at the moment. So far, nothing of major significance. Sort of taking everything in here. So we can take it full speed. Oh, a little bit of clipping there. I just heard it beep. So I'm keeping an eye on the little clipping gauge there. So far, it doesn't really feel significantly different at all, but I did notice that little bit of clipping there, so we might just go in. We'll see if it happens again. We're close to the edge, but that's where I had it for the Pro as well. Through Maggots and Beckett's here. Yeah, I'm maybe a little more lack of fine detail in the force feedback, just around that response time, I think it is. Obviously, we'll play around with the slew rate adjustments once we get into our finer testing, but as a first impression, there's maybe just a slightly noticeable softness in the overall force feedback detail. I commented with a comparison between the Pro and the Ultimate that the Ultimate felt a little tiny bit sharper, perhaps to the point for some people where it actually the Pro actually feels a little bit smoother, I think is what I said. And this, whoops, we shifted down too many gears. This just takes that a little bit further, so that overall the force feedback feels smoother again, but it just lacks that slight fine detail just in the really rapid movements like bumps and stuff that the Pro has. So it's definitely a more significant difference between this and the Pro than the Pro was with the Ultimate, I would say. I feel like if it were a blind test, I would be able to tell the difference between this, even at the same strength, and the Pro. Whereas with the Ultimate and the Pro, at the same strength, I would not be able to tell the difference. I went for 6th gear again. We'll finish up this lap and then I'm going to crank it up to 100% strength and see what my initial impressions are of 17 Newton meters versus the 25 with the Pro, see if it's worth it. But so far, I mean, look, it's one of those things, like, I can't tell you where to spend your money, but I can tell you that even just as an initial impression, I feel like that extra 200 euros or so for the Pro, to me at least, would probably be justified just in the extra detail that it brings to the table. I mean, it's not anything I don't think that's going to make you faster. I definitely don't see it as being something that's going to give you an edge over the competition by any means, but it is a noticeable difference. So anyway, let's crank the strength up now. So we're going here. We'll crank all the way up to our 17.1 Newton meters. So before, remember with the Pro, we cranked it up to 25, which was the maximum there. And I said that, 25 Newton meters was still more than anybody who wasn't the Hulk would ever need. So let's see how we feel about 17. So we'll crank that there. We'll minimize this off. We'll go back into options here in iRacing. And we will crank our wheel force here up to 17 Newton meters as well. There we go. All right, let's do it again. Okay, so no difference in road texture or anything like that here, stationary. It feels a little heavier, but you know, you expect that. Let's drive out. Okay, so that's bringing a bit of the detail in. And I figured this would be a good car to test with again, obviously because it's the same car as we tested with before, but it's a very old school sort of mechanical car to drive. So it doesn't dampen the effects like some of the other cars do. Obviously, we'll test more cars as we get on in the review, but as a first impression, yeah, I mean, even with the increased strength, I am still noticing the force feedback overall just does feel a little bit more dampened than what it felt with the Pro, which is what I expected. So definitely noticeable, but let's focus more on the strength now. So as you can see, I'm not the thickest guy around by any means. And this feels like it's a good strength for me for driving a car like this. I feel like anything more than this would probably be too much and I'd start to struggle to drive the car. But I will say that if you're a really chunky person, if you're a lot bigger than me, you might want a little bit more strength here. Now, Niels Husingfeldt has a really good video where he went into the details of calculating force feedback strength and stuff like that based on real life. And look, most road cars sit somewhere around the sort of 8 Newton meter mark, 8 to sort of 11, 12 Newton meter mark. Obviously, unless you're crashing into a wall or something, but cars like this and Indy cars, for example, can be up to sort of the 30 Newton meter mark in terms of cornering forces and things like that. So I feel like that extra dynamic range that the additional 7 Newton meters gives you, or the extra 32% of dynamic range that you get with the Pro over the Sport, is probably worth the extra money. And that's not to say that you're going to have a bad experience with the Sport by any means. It's still an absolutely brilliant wheelbase. There's no question about that. And it's one of those things that you wouldn't know what you were missing until you tried a Pro. But yes, my initial impression at least is that I feel like the Pro is worth the extra money over the Sport. I feel like that little extra bit of definition that you get in the force feedback detail just because of the increased response time, as well as that extra dynamic range that you get out of 25 Newton meters, is probably worth it, at least if you're driving these kind of old school cars. We'll comment on it more in my summarized thoughts once we've had some experience with some other cars as well. We'll do some GT cars, we'll do a bunch of different sim titles as well, but it's just not quite leaving me with that same mind-blown impression that I had with the Pro and the Ultimate. I think the Pro really blew my mind because, you know, it costs half as much as the Ultimate, and I really didn't expect it to be so close in terms of performance. Whereas this is definitely a bigger gap. Anyway, I'll shut up and I'll let you just watch a lap. And then we'll get into my deeper analysis. Definitely could have carried more speed there. Definitely not my best lap. Just noticed a little bit of clipping there again, so need to fine tune just on that change of direction. It just clipped a little bit, so we'll fine tune the iRacing settings a little bit. It's only just nicking clipping, and that's where you want it. You want to be using as much of that dynamic range as you possibly can without clipping. So it's certainly not enough clipping to impact the impressions of driving, but I just wanted to highlight that there in case you guys did notice the little bar turn red or the little beeping sound. I've got it set up so it beeps whenever it clips, so we know. But yeah, I only saw it do it twice, and it was only just in that sharp change of direction. So we'll fine tune the settings a little bit more before we do our extended driving tests. And yeah, let's fast forward now, and we'll take you through all of my observations after 2 weeks of experience. Okay, so I ended up spending quite a lot more time swapping between the Pro and the Sport than I did swapping between the Pro and the Ultimate, simply because the difference between these two is quite a lot greater than it was with the Pro and the Ultimate. I spent quite a lot of time making fine-tuning adjustments in the TrueDrive software, particularly around static force reduction and slew rate adjustment. And yeah, like I was able to dial things in and sort of get better feeling between individual sims. So I was able to sort of dial in the consistency between the sims, which always does take a bit of effort on Simucube wheelbases compared to Fanatec wheelbases, where the experience is a lot more consistent across various different sim titles. We'll talk about that more in the next video where we compare Simucube against Fanatec. But yeah, look, overall, in terms of the driving experience, I feel like, again, it was pretty uniform once we had things dialed in. The only real detectable differences between the Pro and the Sport, as we expected, and as would be reflected by the spec sheet as well, is just in the dynamic range as well as the response time. Otherwise, the overall feeling of both wheelbases is very, very similar. With the Pro and the Ultimate, I felt like they were very, very similar to each other, and there wasn't a whole lot in it. And I think that boils down to mostly the fact that the difference in slew rate is a lot closer on the Pro and Ultimate, so you don't really feel that difference in the response quite so vividly. But also because the dynamic range is so much higher on the Pro already, stepping it up from 25 to 32 Newton meters of dynamic range between the Pro and the Ultimate really isn't as significant as going from the 17 Newton meters to the 25 Newton meters of dynamic range between the Sport and the Pro, simply because, you know, 32 Newton meters is so far beyond what the majority of people are going to be using in the first place. So before we go any further, I just want to spend a little bit of time explaining exactly what I mean when I'm talking about dynamic range here, because I think it's important to sort of get your head around that to really understand what we're talking about here in detail. Now, we have covered this before when we did our comparison between the Fanatec DD1 and DD2, but I'm going to cover it again for you guys now, just in the context of the Sport versus the Pro. So let's have a little bit of a chat about dynamic range now. So dynamic range in the context of a wheelbase refers to the amount of force that's available both to reproduce the forces that we'd feel through the steering wheel, as well as fight against the forces that we're inputting through our own arms fighting against the cars. Now, those forces are a function of lateral force, slip angle, and aligning torque. But for the context of this video, at least, I have put some references if you want to learn more below. But for the context of this video, all we really need to know is that most cars are going to fall somewhere between the sort of 9 to 14 Newton meter mark in terms of the amount of force that you feel through the steering. But some cars, like say old school Indy cars, Formula One cars, for example, they can push all the way up to closer to 30 Newton meters. Now, what we have here in front of us is a graph showing time along the bottom and force in Newton meters along the left-hand side here. And you can see we've got increments of 5 Newton meters with a maximum of 25. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a green marker here. I'm going to put a little mark here at 17 Newton meters, and that is representing the maximum amount of force that's available to us for the Simucube 2 Sport. So we'll run that across, and then we're going to take a different color marker. We're going to take a red marker, and we're going to draw another line at 25 Newton meters to represent the total amount of force or peak force that's available to us on a Pro. So run that across. Okay. So let's imagine we're coming into a high-speed turn here. So as we start to turn in, the forces that we're feeling through the steering are beginning to increase. We might run over a few little bumps in the road. We might rub against another car and get a big spike in the force. But generally speaking, the force is going to be increasing as we approach our maximum. Now, if we've tuned our force feedback correctly, we shouldn't ever go over the maximum amount of force that's available to us, because that's where we start to get clipping. And we'll talk about clipping in just a moment. But you can imagine we're starting to get into the maximum amount of force here through the turn. It's starting to taper off, and then we run into the ripple strip, so we get a big spike all the way up to 25 Newton meters, which is our peak. We're rubbing against other cars, we're doing things, we're running over bumps, and then as we start to come out of the turn again, the forces begin to taper off back down towards what they would be just on a normal straight. We might have a few little bumps there in the road, and it comes back down. So it's a pretty crude drawing there, but you get the basic idea. The aim here is that we never want to go over the maximum amount of force that's available to us, because that's where clipping starts to occur. So what we've done here is we've used the full amount of dynamic range, being 25 Newton meters, that's available to us on the Simucube 2 Pro. Now you can imagine if we were doing exactly the same thing with the Simucube 2 Sport, if we want to reproduce the same amount of forces that we felt down at the lower part of the scale, and we're going to draw it slightly underneath just so we're not running over ourselves. But say we want to reproduce the exact same amount of force here, or very close. What's going to happen when we hit 17 Newton meters? Everything over that is going to clip. So we're going to flatline, and we're not going to feel any detail over that mark. And then it's going to come back down, and it's going to match again. So what we're effectively having to do is reduce our dynamic range and squish everything down to fit within our maximum. So what we would end up with, assuming we're not using any other forms of compression like static force reduction or anything like that, what we're going to end up with is a line that looks a little bit more like this, tapering off here and going up. So it looks exactly the same, but the dynamic range is less. So you can see now what we're missing out on is all this extra strength and all this extra detail in this lower portion here, because we're not wanting to clip at the higher end. And this is where I think people get a little bit lost when we're talking about strength, because it's not all about just how much force you can feel. It's about the dynamic range that's available to you to work within. If you want to feel, say, 17 Newton meters of peak force throughout a turn, then if you want to experience that, but you also want to be able to feel a big bump when you run over a ripple strip without clipping, then you need to have that additional headroom available to you. Otherwise, you're simply not going to have that detail available. Now, if we take it a step further and look at something like, say, a Logitech G923, for example, that only has about 2.5 Newton meters available to it. So we draw a little line here at the 2.5 mark. And you can imagine now all of this detail is all going to have to be compressed down underneath this line. So all this detail is just going to be sitting in here, run into the bump, it goes up, and then it tapers off again now. So you can see this is the difference between an expensive wheelbase and an entry-level wheelbase. This is all the detail that you're missing out on. Now the detail is still there, but the variation in the effects just isn't. So you're very limited in what you're able to reproduce in a more limited dynamic range. So hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully that illustrates the importance of having that additional dynamic range available. But obviously you do reach a point of diminishing return, and this is what we were talking about yesterday when we were talking about the Pro compared to the Ultimate. I can't think of many examples where somebody would actually need more than 25 Newton meters of peak force. I just can't see a scenario where somebody's going to want to be, pulling 25 Newton meters through a corner and then have it spike all the way up to 32 Newton meters. So for me, at least, in my opinion, I feel like 25 Newton meters is a pretty good mark for maximum dynamic range. I feel like anything over that for the majority of people is going to be just excessive. So with that now explained, to me at least, I feel like my initial impression was pretty much spot on. I feel like the Pro is worth the extra 200 euros over the Sport for the majority of people, but the differences in the response time and dynamic range are less noticeable when you're dealing with more Simcade style titles. So it's definitely, particularly the difference in response time is most noticeable in titles like, your iRacing, your Assetto Corsa Competizione, titles that generally have more detail in them to begin with. When I was playing titles like F1 2020, Dirt Rally 2, Project Cars 2, and so forth, the difference was a lot less stark. So I feel like, yeah, if you really want to get your money's worth out of the difference between the sport and the pro, it's really going to be best realized if you're playing those sort of more high-end sim titles, so to speak. But yeah, look, I feel like for me at least, and most likely for the majority of people, if you were to go out and buy a sport, you're going to be happy with it. If you were to then go and try a pro for a week and then go back to the sport, you'd probably wish that you'd bought the pro. That's my honest opinion on that, at least anyway. Whereas with the ultimate, I feel like if I had a pro and then I tried an ultimate, I wouldn't kind of have any buyer's remorse. I wouldn't really have any regret. I'd be perfectly happy with the pro. So yeah, that's my feelings on the matter, at least. One thing that I do want to make really clear here is that when I say the pro is a worthwhile upgrade over the sport, I mean in terms of the overall immersion and experience of sim racing. My lap times between the pro and the sport were absolutely identical, whether it was, you know, a hot lap in a qualifying session or, you know, throughout the course of a race. There was absolutely no difference in terms of my consistency or speed. And that kind of falls into what I was saying before. None of the extra detail that you feel with the pro is going to make you faster. It's just purely down to that immersion and that overall experience of driving. So that's my feelings on the matter, at least. But look, I mean, at the end of the day, all three of these wheelbases are exceptionally high quality, both in terms of their, you know, their build quality, the materials they use, the fit and finish, the way they look, the way they feel. The quality of the force feedback is absolutely exceptional on all three of them. Honestly, you're not going to have a bad experience with any of these, but for me at least, I think the sweet spot is the pro. I think that the ultimate is going to be a waste of money over the pro for the majority of people, but the pro is a significant and worthwhile upgrade over the sport. So look, guys, I really do hope that you found these videos useful. You know, obviously the aim here is to try and help you guys out as much as possible, use the experience that we have with all those various different sim racing gears that we get to have through the studio here these days, to really sort of share that experience with you and help you guys make the right decisions. So if you're not already subscribed, I really would appreciate if you would consider hitting that button. As I've said in previous videos, only about 30% of the people that are watching these videos are actually subscribed, and subscribing and hitting the notification bell really does help YouTube to see this as valuable content and show it to more sim racers, which will hopefully help more people out in the long run. So I really do appreciate your support there. Leave a thumbs up if you've enjoyed the video, and above all, thank you guys very much for watching. I really do hope that you're getting value out of this series. Next, we're going to be moving to the Fnatic Direct Drive versus Simucube 2. I'm a little bit nervous about that one because I know that whatever I say, it's probably going to upset half of the sim racing community, but we're just going to keep it to the facts. We're going to keep it raw and honest, and yeah, hopefully that will help you guys out as well. So thank you very much for watching as always, guys, and I will see you again soon. Bye.